Who hasn't had a fractured relationship in business and in life? Douglas Bouey gives us an 8-step process to restore shattered relationships and guides leaders and entrepreneurs to repair them with a solid process. Let's hear about his effective process. Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Berus, and today we have Douglas Bouey. Douglas, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, and you're the author of Fixing Fractures, Restoring Shattered Relationships in Business and in Life. What a book. Tell me, what made you instigate you to write this book?
Well, I was privileged to meet a very exemplary man named John Constantouris. And John developed this process. It's a very unique process. It carries a lot of freight. And I saw him work with it, and I just said, I need to learn that. And later on, John made me a colleague. And as I understand it, there are no others that know this process as I do. And John has unfortunately passed on. So, I'm in situations when I'm coaching and facilitating where I see these horrible discords that just wrench people's souls. And I found that this process that John taught me and I worked with for many years to be uniquely effective in dissolving that kind of enmity.
So give us some examples, even personal examples that you've had where this process has helped you. First, the experience and then the process.
Well, here's an example in a family company, and I must say this arises a lot in family companies, but it's not unique to family companies. Two brothers in charge of U.S. and Canadian divisions. They're pitted against each other by a founder, the father, who is stepping away. But as is so typical of these sorts of folks, he's hanging in, hanging around, and hanging on. And in that process, he created an excruciating dynamic of separation that echoed and competition that echoed down through both divisions. So there was no alignment, no communication, and lost opportunity littered the landscape. The family occasions were super stilted, very painful. So we used this process in this session to dissolve the fractures between the father and each of the sons. And in fact, the sister sat in and she had some too, and between the two brothers. And at a particular moment, one of the brothers said to the father, the sister, and I in the session, "Get out of here." And, "Oh, what do you mean?" "Well, leave the room. We want you to go away." So we did leave the room and we wondered what the heck was going on. And about an hour and a half later, they came out and they called us back in the room and said, "You're fired."
Oh, wow.
"Whoa, you're fired. What's that all about?" "We've worked it out. We've got all the rest of it done and we're fixed. We're in line." So away they went, and they had a marvelous run of collaboration and support, mutual support for each other that was just explosive.
Okay, so tell us now about your process that helped them in this process, helped them resolve their issue, I would say.
Well, the first thing about this approach is that it requires a use of a stepwise process that's laid out in the book called the resolution protocol. And that is coupled with the relationship mindset, which is a particular way of looking at difference between people. Because difference is normal. If we didn't have difference, we wouldn't have anything creative come out of life. But people regard difference as a bad thing, something to be stamped out. They need to look at it otherwise, and we tell them about that in the book. And then they need to prepare. And this is critical, that they sit down, sort out the dynamics of the situation on a bunch of criteria, and work that out in advance. And then they have
okay,
a scripted...
You're going a little too fast because it's super interesting, this process, but you have to give us examples so that we can really project the situation, like the differences. So how do you determine how people are different? Do you as assessments? Do you talk it out? How's that process actually implemented?
Well, I think the way that difference makes itself manifest is people in relationship have a fracture. They've got something that's broken between them. And, you as a coach, Katrina, would often run into the situation where you hear of a breakdown that has happened between people. So, there doesn't have to be too much diagnosis to say there's a real relationship problem here.
Okay, so you gave us an example of these two people in the same business that are not getting along. So the first step, you said you highlight their difference. So how did you do that between these two business people?
Well, with them, it was a matter of saying, they called me in and said, the father called me in actually and said, this really isn't working. And so we managed to convene them together and get them to say, yes, we would work on it. And then we identified a number of incidents where the two of them had suffered breaches of trust.
I see.
And
okay.
That's the essential element, is where did the trust break between you?
Okay, so where there was felt like there was a betrayal between them that
exactly
hurt the relationship. So that's the differences, that is the first process, is that right?
Well, the stepwise is to identify an incident.
Okay.
And when people have had a breach of trust, there's often a cascading series of things that have occurred. But what I ask them to do is identify one incident, because when people can talk about one incident, they can keep track. They can't keep track of 7 incidents, but they can keep track of one incident. And the whole spirit of fixing fractures is that we want people to go through the whole process staying together with us. So when one person is talking, we don't want them to be making cases against the other person. We want them to say the setup of the incident, for instance, in a way that the other person agrees with. So inflammatory conclusions, judgments, inferences have no part in that. They have to be confronted with something that they can stay abreast with.
Okay, so that's the first step in your process, is really identify where the trust started to erode. And to, like you rightly said, identify one incident so that they don't expand into a dialogue of, resentment. And then the other one has to agree that that happened in that way. Is that right or not?
And that's usually done by a very careful statement of the facts that does not include any dressing up or case building. It's just like the way lawyers present evidence in court. They can only talk about what they saw, heard, or what can be pointed to or produced as a physical fact. So when the matter is laid out in that kind of dry, sequential fashion, the other person goes along and says, yes, that's right, that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And if there is an error, in fact, it'll quickly be raised, because both parties are operating in a very high emotional quotient.
Yes, I would imagine so.
Mm-hmm.
So they identify and agree on an event that was maybe the element that was perceived as a betrayal by the other person, or as a lack of the trust was affected. Broken, right. So then you said you go to the second step, which is prepare.
Well, I'm talking about the elements that precede the actual process, where you're getting into the protocol itself. The step that is important that people need to do is they need to cast this relationship. They need to understand and hear a version of the relationship that the person feels they had, because this process is one about bringing relationships back in line after they've gotten off course. So we need to say at the beginning, this is the sort of relationship we had. And it may be that there were several relationships, particularly in family business. There may be, we're, brothers and sisters. We're also co-owners of a business. We may be executives in the operation of the business. So being clear on what aspect of the relationship we're trying to focus in on is important.
So, for example, if there was a discord or between siblings, a brother and a sister, for example, and then they have to agree when that started in a very factual way, so you take away some of the emotions. Okay.
We're getting there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then?
Then it's important that people, having understood, okay, I understand the role that we're focusing in on. I understand the situation that you're talking about. And now the person who is leading, and we call that person the initiator, sets out the emotional impact of that situation upon them and upon their identity. So they might be frustrated, angry, sad, disappointed. And they need to tell the other person that that's the case. And they need to end that statement with this final word. And those are mine to deal with. Those emotions are mine to deal with. Mm-hmm. Because we're not in this to manipulate the other person through our emotions or through their emotions or to attempt to read their emotions for them. And so we try to keep the emotions in a particular place. And that is the strength of this whole process, is it keeps everything in very clear compartments so they don't get messed with the other parts of a contentious matter.
So saying those are mine to deal with basically makes that person responsible for their emotions and doesn't entice the other person to react to what's just been said.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's there for information.
Right.
This is the impact on me, and I need you to know that. But what you do with it is your business, and I'm responsible to look after my own emotional well-being.
Mm-hmm. Then what's next?
This is the hard one.
Oh, good.
It's called
I like
100, 100% to zero. And what that means is that the initiator is now going to take 100% ownership of how this breach was created or continued. And that is a soul-searching expedition and a very difficult time for the ego, as you might imagine.
Yes. So give us an example how you've succeeded to do that within a case.
Well, let's say a business executive is talking to a subordinate with whom they've had a breach of trust. It's not appropriate, and that's why it's important to make sure that the role framing for this whole thing is cast at the beginning. It's not appropriate for the person to go outside their role framework. So if somebody failed to produce a proposal when they were supposed to, the dialogue might go something like, I wasn't clear enough with you on the deadline for this proposal. I guess I didn't provide a framework for you to understand the context for the proposal in which it was being done. I wasn't clear enough about the deadline. So that sort of discussion, not a discussion like, I could have come across the table and done the proposal for you. That wouldn't be role appropriate.
I see. It's taking accountability for the event that happened that was the cause of the discord.
Yes, completely. Leaving nothing for the other person.
Wow. So how does the other person react?
Well, of course, what we're trying to do is get them to open toward us. And generally, when you've become so vulnerable by doing this, the other person, if they have a soul, is going to come toward you. And that's what we ask next is, so what happened from your perspective? Tell us how this impacted you. Tell us what you thought went on, and drawing the other person out so that they come forward with their version of this situation. And what generally is found is that as that proceeds, things start to melt. Things start to get much more fluid and open. And then we proceed through telling the other person, this is where I want to end up in this relationship. This is the way I want our discussion to conclude. And then we negotiate.
So what are the examples you have of telling them where they want to end up? They said, I want to make you now my best friend. I don't think so. So you can tell us something that sounds...
No, I would think that it would, if you're talking about, say, working with a subordinate, I want us to have a fully open and trusting relationship. I want us to be completely collaborative. I want us to be transparent, that sort of thing.
Okay. So the type of relationship they want, and probably communicate the way they want to be informed, yes. Collaboration. Like say, hey, just so your last comment is, I want this relationship to be collaborative. It might be different what one person think as collaborative than the other.
Yes.
Which will have future discord. So how'd you handle that?
Well, first of all, we enter into negotiation, and a negotiation is much the same as any other negotiation. That is, versions of how to solve the problem are put forward, and they're tested, and then they're elaborated on and discussed from an implementation perspective. But then we have a very unique addition, and that is a pressure testing question. How might this solution be sabotaged?
Ah, good.
So what happens then, and this is, you can imagine by this time, perhaps the discussion has gone on for 20 minutes, half an hour at least. By this time, people are much more open with each other, and they can explore past issues of breaches of trust that have compounded the relationship difficulty between them. And that's what the pressure testing question brings up.
Very good. Right, wonderful. So tell us now the 6 steps so that we have it.
Well, it's actually 8, but I'll go through them.
Oh, the 8. That's wonderful. Okay.
Yeah. The role in relationship.
Okay.
The facts, the emotions, emotional impact and identity, 100% to 0 accountability by the initiator, the version of the other party, the destination, the negotiation, and the arrival.
Okay, the role and relationship. 2, facts. Yes. 3, emotions and identity. So here, emotions, we can all understand that. What do you mean by identity?
Well, I came across that notion in the book Difficult Conversations by Stone and Heenan. Mm-hmm. And it's very important because people have these crushing incidents end up saying something to the other person about their capacity as a partner, or perhaps their status as a wife, or these various ways in which identity is communicated. And when people feel that, they get a stab like, you're not a good friend. Whoa, that's pretty heavy. That's much heavier than an emotional impact.
I see. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the clarity. And then the 100% to 0 is really taking complete accountability for the discord of the relationship, like you gave us an example.
In the incident, particularly around the incident. And the keys to that, Katrina, are to kind of go out back with yourself. And this is why the preparation is so important. And to use 3 words, woulda, coulda, shoulda. What is it that if I would have done, this would never have happened? What could I have done that would have made sure that this never came about? And what should a person in my role or capacity be doing in order that these kinds of things don't come up? And when you start looking at it through that filter, then you make your list of the things that you did not do that resulted in this incident coming about.
Very good. Okay. And then there's the version of the other. So you have the other person after the person takes accountability of the woulda, coulda, shoulda, and then the other person gives their version. And you've set up the situation where they can do it and feel comfortable because the other person has shown their vulnerability. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's what happens if we're very careful not to introduce any extraneous matter and we're vulnerable as the initiator, then the VIP, we call them the VIP, will tend to come forward more fully. And if they don't come forward very fully, then we haven't done a very good job of creating the necessary safety.
Mm-hmm. And the next step is you communicate the destination, that is where you want the relationship to go. Then you negotiate it, right? And how it's implemented.
Yes.
And then the arrival.
Well, you missed the pressure testing, which is so important.
Okay, so when does that take place?
In the negotiation, once the first sort of the settlement or the solution to the first presenting incident is crafted.
Uh-huh.
And so we ask, what might sabotage this resolution?
Uh-huh.
And of course, what would sabotage the resolution are the other sources of low trust between them.
Yes.
And so what you might end up doing is you might end up going through a string of breaches of trust on the same structured basis. But this time you're going to be winging it.
I see. Tell me, when does the pressure testing take place in the 8-step process?
In the 7th step, the negotiation step. So perhaps it would work like this. Okay, I'm going to apologize. I apologize to you for having put you on the spot unfairly. And not only am I going to do that, but I'm going to say that I'm apologizing to you in front of our full executive committee because that's where I misstated this thing. And so the other person says, so that'll be fine. And then they ask the pressure testing question. And once that's out in place, they said, yeah, but I don't really believe that you mean it, because I've seen in the past when you've made apparent concessions and then you've kind of backed away from them otherwise. Well, when did that happen? Well, I remember a time in 2019 when you embarrassed me in front of another group. Okay, let's talk through that.
I see. Okay, that's a wonderful example. And then the arrival. Can you comment on that?
Two things there that are important. One, we need to say what we've agreed. So after all this discussion, we've come to a conclusion and come to an understanding. And we need to document that and say that between us so that we're clear. And sometimes that results in some further elaboration that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And then the last part is we need to celebrate that we are working together toward our true purpose. And that's very important to end with that.
Wonderful, wonderful process. And I encourage the listeners to check out his book, Fixing Fractures, Restoring Shattered Relationships in Business and in Life. So if you're struggling with a relationship that is really with no trust and you feel betrayed, this might be a very important book to read, not only for yourself, but also for your coaching practice. Thank you very, very much, Douglas Bouey. We've come to the end of our podcast. Thanks for sharing your experience and your knowledge.
Thank you so much, Katrina.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.